Good morning. Can everyone hear me at this level? Wendy? Thumbs not so up. Should I speak a little louder maybe? This is all right? Yes, fantastic. Thank you. How is everyone doing this morning? Well, we made it. You stuck with me for 5 lectures. Somehow you stuck with me. Thank you so much. I have to say once again that to me these lectures are the biggest treat. They're the thing I most look to in the year, forward to in the year. So thank you for being here because that is what lets me do these lectures. Without you they would not happen. So thank you very much. So we made it to our 5th and final lecture. We've thus far talked about a range of objects in different media and from different periods, although they were admittedly concentrated in my period of specialty, the 16th and the 17th centuries. So we started looking at this silver processional cross from the late 16th century. Then we talked about one of my favorite paintings in the collection, Ribera's Portrait of a Knight of Santiago, and you know I'm quite particular to portraiture. Then we looked at this spectacular large drawing attributed to Matias de Torres. Last week, we talked about Luisa Roldan's wonderful terracotta infant St. John the Baptist. And I should note here, 2 of the docents pointed out to me, and I'm very grateful to them, that when I showed this wonderful sculpture, I neglected to mention that it was actually given in honor of Luis Martin. So I wanted to point that out because, of course, this is the Luis Martin lecture series in the Humanities, and any opportunity to remember that great scholar, great speaker, great person is a good one. So I want to do that here and rectify my mistake. And finally, today we'll be speaking about this painting, Joaquin Dominguez Becker's Ladies and Gentlemen Visiting a Patio of the Alcazar in Seville from 1857. When Anne Kinseth asked me to choose my 5 works, things that Adam likes, I thought, what a fun challenge it will be to talk about a work that is not from my century, from a century that I have never fully studied. And in November, that seemed like a great idea. On Monday of this week, it seemed like not such a great idea. But I have to say, I did get very excited about it. And so I hope I can convey some of that interest and excitement that I've developed in it to you today. So the talk today is going to have 6 parts. And I'll start first by telling you where we are when we look at this picture. And the picture is, if I'm not mistaken, currently on display. It is. Wendy's nodding. Thank you, Wendy. So you'll be able to see it in the galleries. It's not a large picture, but it is a depiction of the Alcazar of Seville, the great fortress, palace, and garden complex in the center of that city. The painting, as you can see, is rich with detail. We have a view onto a patio, actually a specific patio in that complex, the so-called Patio de las Muñecas, the patio or courtyard of the dolls. And it's one of the smaller courtyards within that larger complex, and it's actually quite a, let's call it, accurate representation of that space. This is a 19th century photograph, probably dating right around the time of the painting as well, when you can see how closely Beckett has rendered the wonderful stucco work of the palace, how he's rendered the tiles, how he's rendered the rhythm produced by the columns and the light and shadow that fill this space. But interestingly, because he's working in painting, he's able to do something that photographs can't. So the lens of the photograph wasn't able to capture the full breadth of the courtyard because the photographer quite simply couldn't step far enough back because his back would hit the wall. And here the painter is able to, giving the impression of immense accuracy, actually create a sort of slightly invented scene, producing what only a painter could. the scene is also filled with ladies and gentlemen looking up, admiring, and pondering the space, and we'll talk more about their importance later. Now, I'm curious, how many of you have been to Seville? Quite a few. So I'm assuming that many of you visited the Alcázar, many of you are familiar with that space, that important space within Seville. This is a plan, a bird's eye plan of that complex, and the different colors all refer to different stages in the construction of this monument. So when we talk about the Alcázar, we're actually talking about a very complex, multi-stage construction, one that transforms and changes during the centuries as in some ways reflecting the political upheavals and changes of alliance that happen in that city in the 12th, 13th centuries and onwards. The oldest surviving parts of the palace, this is one of them, the so-called Patio del Yeso, the courtyard of plaster, you could say, or the courtyard of stucco, was unearthed in the 19th century. But this dates to the 12th century. This is the oldest part, the Almohad remnants of the palace. Later elements, such as the main entrance that you'll probably remember, is constructed under Pedro the Cruel. There's a great name. In the 14th century, combining a number of stylistic elements that drew on the local vernacular style of architecture, including so-called muqarnas decoration made out of stucco, as well as script in both Latin letters and in what's called Kufic letters. So combining both Spanish, Latin, and Arabic in one inscription. We also have parts of the palace that are what we might recognize as Gothic. This is the so-called Salon Gótico with the arches that would in some ways be more familiar from Northern architecture. If you think, for instance, of the cathedrals of France or of England, we have spectacular latticework ceilings and domes, such as this one over the room of the ambassadors. We have spectacular patios filled with vegetation and water. These are as much spaces that are indoor spaces as they are outdoor spaces, and in many of them it's impossible to separate the experience of being outside. That is in some ways an integral element of how this palace was meant to be experienced. And then, of course, the larger, in some ways you might call formal gardens that extend beyond it. So the garden is an essential part of the Alcázar complex, but we see that it's a structure that arises and changes over time. When we get to the 19th century, the structure has changed enormously from those earlier periods from the 14th century. There have been fires, there have been reconstructions, there have been different sorts of campaigns that affected the appearance of the building. And in the 19th century, on the surge of an interest in the past, a scholarly interest in the past, the city of Seville decides that it's time to bring the palace back to its old splendor. They call a number of individuals to this task, and the task is in some ways not a neutral one, because they're making decisions that are oftentimes inspired by aesthetic preferences. They're making decisions that are not necessarily historically accurate in the way that we might think of today. So it's also important to remember that when we look at medieval monuments throughout Spain today, many of them are in some ways affected by 19th century conceptions of the past. And the 19th century in some ways is this major moment for rethinking the past, and in some ways is a way that for us translates how these monuments look. There is an interesting text, a guide to the city of Seville, published in 1858, that I'd like to read from for you, because it's published just the year after the painting that interests us. So the author writes, beginning in 1833, the restoration of the Alcázar was first proposed. And in effect, the first 2 floors of the beautiful patio of the dolls were built. However, it was not finished. I've spent a fair amount of time this week trying to figure out what the author meant by saying that se construyeron, the patio was built, because this is, in fact, a space that dates to the 14th century. However, it seems that it was subjected to a very significant campaign of reconstruction, but also of, in some ways, construction anew. So in places where elements were entirely lacking, the artists and architects involved in the project of reconstruction created them based on their imaginations. And so an example of this is precisely this patio, patio del yeso, the patio of stucco that I mentioned to you, which is included as a photograph in this newspaper from 1915 as being recently rediscovered. It was rediscovered in the mid-19th century in the same period that those efforts to reconstruct and renew the palace are underway. And so this, I think, in some ways visualizes how important the 19th century is to this process of recreation and in some ways of rediscovery of these monuments. Going back to our text, we read, and there's a familiar name, that the illustrious and distinguished artist Joaquín Domínguez Beckett was placed in charge of this difficult project. And he had already been named director of the restoration of the Alcázar in 1843. In effect, during 1856 and 1857, the year our painting is painted, the Alcázar was entirely transformed. And today we see it as lovely, as splendid, and as admirable, perhaps, as in the times of Kings Pedro I and Charles V. So in the very time that he is painting our painting upstairs, he's actually not only in charge of the restoration of the Alcázar, he's actually living inside of it as the director of the restoration. So it gives us a real sense that the space that he's rendered in paint is a space with which he's intimately familiar. And in fact, a space in which he likely had a significant hand in terms of crafting its appearance in the period. So what we see in his painting as a sort of accurate representation of a historic patio in many ways is as contemporary as the painting that depicts it. It's enough to remember that before, all one could see in the Alcázar was the slightest vestige of the gilding, the colors and the ornaments of its walls, columns, arches, and ceilings. Everything was whitewashed so that the relief of the carvings and capitals disappeared. So again, when we see those sites, let's remember that they are subject to a process of evaluation that changes and affects how we see them today. And so anytime we see these kinds of monuments and try to think about the accuracy of them historically, we have to remember that we're seeing them through a lens of 19th century interpreters of those monuments. Now, when we talk about Beckett, so we know already something about him. We know that he's in charge of the reconstruction of the Alcázar, but of course he's also a successful painter in his own right. He's part of a family of painters. His brother is a painter, his father is a painter. His 2 nephews are very well-known painters, Valeriano Domínguez Beckett and Gustavo Adolfo Beckett are both important painters in their own right. So he's part of a dynasty. When we talked about Roldana, we talked about how artists trained in the 17th century. It was most likely for an artist to come up in a workshop or a family of artists. And in some ways in the 19th century, we're still continuing to see similar patterns of training. He is a successful painter based largely in Seville, but his success will become such that he'll actually be called to Madrid to become the court painter to Queen Isabel. So he does quite well for himself, but during those years he also continues to work on this massive project of the restoration of the Alcázar. There's another painting that's quite similar to ours, very hard to find a good reproduction of it, in Granada, of another patio that he paints. And we see, in some ways, a very similar interest in those spaces. We see, as in our painting, a view out onto a courtyard. We see a contrast of light and shadow. We see an interest in rendering those richly ornamented surfaces. And of course, crucially, we have these modern individuals who sort of are peppered throughout this landscape, and they are looking at it just as we look at them look at it. Beckett painted many scenes of Seville, such as this scene of weary revelers returning home after the carnival, and oftentimes we'll recognize landmarks of Seville, such as in this case the Lonja, or larger, complex, multifigural compositions such as this one, the Feria of Seville, the Seville Fair, and we can once more recognize Seville's major landmarks. You'll notice the Giralda bell tower of the cathedral there in the background, and here we have multiple people sort of reveling in regional costume outside of the city walls. And this was probably works like this from 1867, where he displayed his ability to create this complex multifigural scenes that won him one of his most important commissions, still today in Seville, which was a monumental painting depicting Spain's victory in the African War of the preceding year, and it's the so-called Peace of Huadras between Spanish and Moroccan forces. So we see here a scene of encounter between two previously hostile groups. In some ways, I think it's clear that he's looking to paintings like this one, and so keep in mind, because towards the end of the lecture we'll be talking about another way in which artists think about the past, which is looking to paintings. And in this painting also we see that he is drawing on a repertoire of particular types of figures that actually he likely drew from life when he traveled throughout Morocco in the year preceding the execution of this painting. And in the figure I'm thinking about here is this one, for whom an oil sketch survives at the Prado, and you can see how closely he's here rendered this figure. Now, the reason I mention this painting is because it brings us to an important subject that is necessary to briefly discuss in order to, I think, understand some of the valences of the painting that interests us. And that is the topic of Orientalism in 19th century painting. Now, in some ways, this could be a whole course that lasted 2 semesters and met 3 times a week. And I'm going to try to tell you about it in about 4 minutes. So please forgive me by necessity the brevity and the elisions that is going to produce. However, I think it is necessary to include a brief mention of it in order to understand the painting that interests us. Now, Orientalism very generally is a term that was developed to describe paintings created by Europeans of scenes in what we might call the Middle East, in India, in Persia, and in North Africa. These types of paintings are made by artists in France, in England, in Italy, in the Germanic lands, in Russia. Basically, all European artists in the 19th century become enthralled by this idea of depicting a distant and yet close other place, a place that in some ways can be cast as a strange, distorted mirror reflection of Europe. It's a project that is impossible to separate from the project of European colonialism in those territories, in particular French and English colonialism in North Africa and the Middle East. And of course, it's therefore impossible to separate that from the Napoleonic campaigns. And one of the earliest Orientalist paintings is the famous work of Napoleon visiting the plague victims in Jaffa. And we already see some of the diagnostic elements that are going to feature in many Orientalist paintings. We're going to see a setting that immediately evokes to a European viewer the Middle East, and architectural elements are going to be a crucial way in which that's achieved, in particular through the use of recognizable architectural elements. Horseshoe arches, minarets, patterned walls. These kinds of elements are going to appear as legible attributes of the East to a European imagination. We're going to see the contrast between Europeans and non-Europeans. Dress, but also forms of behavior, are going to be a way in which European artists try to make that relationship clear. And very often, of course, it's going to be casting the people depicted in the Middle East as inferior, as primitive. This is going to be part of this larger project that's connected, of course, to colonialism. We're going to see, of course, that it is also a project that very often eroticizes its subjects. This is going to be a presentation of the Middle East as exotic, as sensual, but of course also as somehow barbarous, right? Somehow less than. And so, of course, we're going to see it in paintings such as this one, the very famous Turkish bath. You'll notice that the women are all sort of languidly sitting on the floor. This is a place where there are no activities to do. There's no work to be done. This is a place where one sort of exists in this permanent state of languid torpor. One of the most famous Orientalist pictures, maybe if you've been to the Clark Art Institute in Western Massachusetts, is this one, Gérôme's Snake Charmer. And we see many of these elements once more. We see an architectural setting that immediately evokes to a European viewer some sort of Middle Eastern setting, in particular through these tiles, and I'll briefly speak about the tiles in a moment, and of course through the garb and behavior of the people who we see depicted within. The tiles are particularly interesting because they're quite a careful representation of Ottoman tile work from the 16th century that was being very vigorously collected by European museums. Museums really wanted these kinds of objects, and the Ottoman Empire, at a certain point, noticing that mosques and tombs were being looted in enormous quantities, banned the exportation of these objects. And actually many artists who traveled between Europe and the Ottoman Empire continued to work illegally exporting these kinds of objects from tombs and historic sites. Now, what's interesting here in Gérôme's painting is that he depicts the tiles that are so desired by European collectors, as in a state of disrepair. The people who live with those tiles on a day-to-day basis are turning their backs on them. In fact, they've even hammered a hammer into the wall in order to hang their weapons on them. And of course, this is a subtle visual argument that Gérôme is making, as one scholar has argued, that the tiles are better treated in European collections, that's where they will be respected and treated and conserved, right? And we're going to see the collections of these objects beginning to fill European homes and, of course, artist studios. And here's Gérôme's studio, an early photograph from the 1880s, where we see actually a large Iznik tile or plate in place of prominence over the door. We see Turkish weapons and carpets surrounding him. So he has filled his studio with these kinds of props that he'll also use to add some sort of legitimacy to his paintings. And of course, we're going to see major museums collecting these kinds of objects, as I mentioned, very, very vigorously. Now, the narrative of Orientalism and of Orientalist painting, that this was simply a European perspective onto a primitivized Middle East, has in recent years been nuanced. Scholars such as Mary Roberts have started paying attention to Ottoman painters who train in Paris with the likes of Jerome, and then return to Istanbul, where they create Orientalist works for Ottoman patrons, suggesting that although the works are formally very similar to European Orientalist works, they are in some ways functioning differently. They're being created by Ottoman artists for Ottoman patrons, and in some ways they therefore become a celebration of the Ottoman past. And this complicates our understanding of Orientalism and its meaning, and it complicates Orientalism's relationship to colonialism in interesting ways. I think this has got to be one of the best depictions of someone reading ever. If someone's ever been really into a book, you know that it doesn't matter that you're at an uncomfortable stone ledge. You're really just into the book. You disappear into it. And I love this sort of gesture of the hand propped up on the chin, propped up on the hand in total engrossment. And this is a work by Osman Hamdi Bey, precisely one of these Ottoman Orientalists who create works for the local Ottoman elite in Istanbul. And here's another work by him where we see once again many of the diagnostic elements of Orientalist painting, but of course created by an Ottoman painter for an elite Ottoman clientele. Now, I mention this in such detail because it will tell us something interesting about Spain's role in all of this. And sure enough, Spain is a very particular place in the story of Orientalism. As you can imagine, Spain, which for centuries was a predominantly Islamic land, in which numerous major monuments from that period survived, was a site that for traveling artists from England, from France, would in some ways be as Oriental, as exotic, as otherly as Egypt or Damascus or other sites that were popular venues for travelers to go to. Spain would become a site for artists to explore these kinds of Orientalist themes in their painting. A French painter depicted here the turbaned king, last king of Granada. When Granada fell to Christian forces in 1492, he's depicting here the last wistful glance of the young king on his defeated city as he flees it on horseback. But also, Spain would become Orientalized in its present. Western European painters would depict themes of Spanish life that persistently and typically included the same themes. Flamenco dancing being a particularly popular one, bullfighting, these kinds of elements that cast Spain as somehow different, as somehow less civilized than the salons of Western Europe, of Paris and of London, where these artists would show their paintings. So Spain could just as much be Orientalized as these other sites by many of the same artists who traveled through them. When large books of lithographs or prints were created for Parisian and French audiences of Spain, they would oftentimes focus primarily on Spain's Islamic monuments, such as you can see here, the Giralda Bell Tower of Seville, and these stylistically Islamic arches through which we see a city view. In depictions of surviving monuments, such as the Alcazar of Seville, which we're now familiar with, and we see here in some ways a very similar space as in our painting upstairs, those spaces are going to be populated not by gentlemen in top hats, but by figures who in some ways evoke the Islamic inhabitants of medieval Spain. These are not going to be modern spaces. These are not going to be museum spaces. These are going to be spaces that exist in a sort of permanent Orientalizing exotic past. Similarly, in scenes like this one, also by a French artist, where we have this group of women in contemporary Spanish dress, they're nevertheless sitting on the floor, evoking a particular behavior that we've now seen becomes wrapped up with these ideas of otherness, of distance, of exoticism, and of this kind of languid behavior that can be associated with the Middle East. So Spain becomes exoticized in interesting ways. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, of course, and we'll have foreign artists sometimes depicting modern Madrid, modern Barcelona. However, it is absolutely more prevalent than with other European places. We'll have many travelers coming through Spain, David Roberts being a particularly famous example. Spain will become a destination for artists who want to experience something closer to home and yet still very, very different. But what's interesting is the role of Spanish artists in this process or in this larger narrative. Because if we look at David Roberts' famous painting in the Prado of the castle of Alcalá de Guadaira outside of Seville, and we compare it to a painting by Genaro Perez Villamil from the same year of the same site, we can see how similarly that Spanish artist and the English artist are depicting the same space. And in fact, it's thought that they met in that year and traveled together to this site in order to depict it. And we see here that the Spanish artist has created an image that is in some ways no less marvelous, no less mysterious than the English one. The role of Spanish artists, therefore, is going to be quite interesting. We're going to see a Spanish artist such as Manuel de Ucel de Guimbarda depict a scene of flamenco dancing in the Alcazar of Seville. In some ways, you could say that this is evoking the same orientalizing tropes that we see when foreign artists do this. But I think it's sort of similar to what happens when Ottoman painters create Orientalist scenes for Ottoman patrons. The valences of that process change. It all of a sudden becomes a sort of celebration of your identity, of your selfhood, in a different way than when an outsider does it, even though in formal terms the image is quite similar to images that foreign artists are producing. Genaro Perez Villamil, I've spelled him here with a G, he's alternatively spelled with a G or a J in his first name, created these monumental two diptychs with views of Spanish cities. You may have seen these. These were a recent acquisition by the Prado from an English collection. And you can see that he's here created these sort of massive Gothicizing frames. You can see here that he's placed his 42 small-scale, painted on tin, scenes within these sort of fantastical, Gothicized forms. And if we look at some of the details of these scenes, we'll see that in his vision of Spain, he includes many Islamic monuments. For instance, in this one, he depicts once more the Alcazar of Seville. We see some of the same elements that we saw in our painting, right? The interest in using shadow and light to highlight the effect of the stucco on a viewer, right? The sort of rich, frenetic surface decoration that is unmistakable as a decorative element of that structure. Or here in the Casa de Pilatos in Seville, the famous aristocratic residence, we see that he includes here a sort of layering of elements with this Isabelline Gothic portal to the chapel, and then this horseshoe arch that leads to it, a stylistically Islamic horseshoe arch. What's interesting, though, is we know that he made this arch appear more Islamic than it actually was. It's, I know, a little hard to see. I spent what seems like hours looking for this exact shot, but what we're looking at is this wall is the chapel wall, and this arch is this large arch. And it's actually quite a simple round arch, not a horseshoe arch at all. So it seems that when painting for foreign patrons from England, he in fact highlighted Spain's Islamic past. He highlighted and added Islamic elements in places where there were none, in some ways performing a kind of exoticizing of Spain where patrons expected to see it, where they sort of wanted to see it, making Spain more exotic than it necessarily was, or highlighting the layering, the cultural layering of its past in this interesting way. But of course, when Spanish artists depict their monuments, it's very often that they'll depict them as populated by contemporary figures, not necessarily by these figures trapped in this sort of distant past. And so we'll notice here that this scene of the Alcazar of Seville, again in the Patio de las Muñecas, the courtyard of the dolls, is like our painting, filled with stylish gentlemen in gleaming top hats and very fitted waistcoats. So unlike those scenes of the same spaces as created by French or English artists. So I think that what that tells us is something quite interesting about Spain's perception of itself as modern, Spain's modernity, you could say. Because when Spain was developing in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were, of course, interested in being economically competitive, in having institutions of government that would be equivalent to any of those in France or England. And of course, they were interested in their past, and they were interested in what their past told them about themselves, about their own selfhood, about their identity, and about their uniqueness within Europe. What we see in this period is the rise of burgeoning national identities and of the attempt by various European nations to highlight qualities that made them unique, that made them stand out. And in Spain, interestingly, one of the elements that is used to develop that kind of sense of identity is precisely Spain's Islamic past. The Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando, the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, in the 18th and 19th century will embark on major projects of documenting Islamic monuments, and then from drawings creating widely disseminated albums of prints. These are two sheets of drawings, both from the 18th century, from these campaigns of documenting these major sites. Both of these are from the Alhambra in Granada. And we're going to see, as part of that same process, also the formalization of museums. Museums as becoming another site in which Spain's identity can be cemented and can be presented to those who see it, both from within Spain, but also importantly those from outside. We see here the painting of the queen consort of Spain, gesturing out an open window to the building of the Prado Museum. Found in 1819, it just celebrated its 200th anniversary. And the Prado being one of these places that is established in order to present the incredible wealth of the royal collections to Spanish visitors, in order to present a sort of vision of Spanishness that could be latched onto in a proud way by Spanish citizens, but also as a way to present Spain's glories to those who visited it from abroad. And we see here that she's gesturing to the newly erected building, and she's also with her left hand pointing to sheets on which paintings are proposed hangings of paintings have been arranged. So you can see these beige-colored squares are actually marked with numbers that correspond to individual artworks. In Seville, too, slightly later, the Museo de Bellas Artes is opened, and it becomes a site that gathers many of the treasures from ecclesiastical collections, from monastic collections in that city. It's in the Mercedarian convent. And so museums will become also sites where Spain's modernity is articulated. And Spanish painters will also, in some ways much more than foreigners traveling to Spain, be excited to represent not just Spain's past, but also Spain's most modern innovations. For instance, here once more, Genaro Perez Villamil depicts the new steel suspension bridge in the northern Spanish city of Fraga. Of course, he fills the banks with, like we saw in that earlier painting, revelers who are gathered for a festival in traditional clothing, but he's contrasting this with the sort of intense modernity, the linearity, the regularness of that massive bridge that has completely transformed the medieval landscape behind it. It's a persistent sort of reminder that Spain is desirous in this period to modernize, to be a modern economy, a modern culture, and that it's succeeding through projects such as this one. Or in this wonderfully sort of Turner-esque painting, the explosion of a locomotive, in some ways not necessarily maybe a successful element of modernity, but nonetheless a very modern theme. Right? This is, of course, a country in which you do have locomotives, in which you do have progress and industry, which are all themes that are being touted as worthy of exploration. So this is also Perez Villamil. So we see the same painters negotiating the position of Spain in very interesting ways. For certain patrons, embracing its sort of strange exoticism, highlighting it even. And for others, creating scenes of Spain's modernity, of Spain's participation in the sort of rat race of European powers. And in this project, I think a painting like this also participates. So I've already highlighted the presence of these viewers within this space, but I want to briefly stress once more how important they are to this sort of message of modernity that Domínguez Beckett here wants to convey. The whole project of renovating the Alcazar of Seville is in fact part of that project of modernity, because Spain is now a country. The argument that he wants to make is that has enough distance from its past that it has the sort of awareness that it's something that it needs to be taken care of and celebrated as something that makes it unique. This is why the city of Seville and the government invests such large quantities of money into the restoration of the Alcázar. And the Alcázar, like the museums of fine arts in Seville, like the Museum of the Prado, becomes a site in which people come to explore their past, right? And so we see here these modern individuals in some ways celebrating, but also thinking back on the space in which they're in, thinking about how that space has participated in constructing who they are as modern individuals. And also they're participating in that space in a leisurely way. These are people who do work. These are people who do have active lives, and they've come into this space as a space of leisure. This is not a person who exists in this kind of permanent, languid state of immobility. These are active movers and shakers, as it were, who are here, coming here because it is their choice to do so. In some ways, in that, it reminds me of perhaps one of the most, you could say, modern paintings of the period, the slightly later wonderful painting by Gustav Klimt from the Art Institute of Chicago. And of course, what we have here is the architecture announcing, in some ways, the modernity of the space with the wonderfully sort of receding linearity of these new Haussmann blocks in Paris, in the reformed Paris. And we have modern individuals strolling, walking through this city, going about their daily tasks as active individuals. And it reminds me of the way in which the people are populating our painting, to the point that actually I think that we can imagine them within that space, that they are not out of place within it. Of course, we should probably give him a top hat and make sure it doesn't get wet. And we can see our couple here equally participating. They should also get an umbrella. Participating in this kind of modern experience of daily life. And you know what? We can bring them in too. Nice change though, it's not raining anymore. It's a sunbrella. So the painting, I hope to have convinced you, in my opinion, is a very modern painting. It reflects directly Joaquin Dominguez Becker's project of being in charge of the restoration of the Alcazar. It reflects the 19th century interest in the past, and it depicts 19th century modern individuals engaging with that past, but using it as a source of leisure in how they think about themselves. Now, in the last section of today's lecture, I'd like to conclude with something that I've already hinted at, which is another way in which artists and viewers more generally thought about the past that informed the present in which they lived. And this is how people looked at the Spanish Golden Age in particular. So we have here Dominguez Beckett depicting one of these historic monuments of the medieval period in Seville. And many artists actually traveled to these sites from, in particular abroad, in order to be inspired by them, in order to have their creativity, as it were, jarred by them. One such figure was John Singer Sargent. Sargent traveled extensively through southern Spain, in fact, was quite enamored of Spain in general. You can even imagine our individual as a sort of sergeant, right, looking out at this gardens in Granada in the Alhambra complex. And Sargent is an interesting starting figure with which to start this conclusion of mine, because if we look at a studio picture of Sargent, you'll recognize his famous portrait of Madame X. You'll see on the walls actually Persian plates. So thinking back to what we talked about the collecting of the Middle East, we'll see various Middle Eastern textiles. But on the wall, we'll see one other picture. I wonder if any of you recognize it. Very, very good. It's a picture that's today at the Hispanic Society of America, and it's titled Dwarf with a Mastiff after Velazquez. Now, interestingly, what I myself did not realize until yesterday evening is that the painting is no longer considered to be by Velazquez himself, but by one of his followers, perhaps by Martínez del Mazo. Nevertheless, in the 19th century, it was firmly attributed to Velazquez. We've talked about attribution, don't forget. These things can change. So we can see that Sargent has very closely looked at this painting. In fact, he's created a nearly one-to-one copy of it. And as we see, let me just go back to the studio, he's traveled with it and he's kept it with him, which is quite interesting. We know, for instance, that he created a copy of Las Meninas, Diego Velázquez's perhaps most famous painting, which he kept with him in his studio for his entire life. So it's so interesting to think of this painter as keeping with him copies of these works that he saw in Madrid many, many years prior. And it is clear that he valued Velázquez enormously. I think we can see the influence of his time in Spain in works such as El Jaleo, the famous painting at the Gardner in Boston. Not only, I want to stress here, in the fact that it is a Spanish scene, right? This is a scene of flamenco dancers and singers in a tavern, but also in the lessons that he's taken from Velázquez. What he stresses in various letters to friends is that what he's most enthralled by in Velázquez is how Velázquez handles paint, in the looseness of Velázquez's brushstrokes, in the vigor with which he applies paint in a seemingly undisciplined manner, but actually in a very, very controlled and masterful way. And we see that with how Sargent's style of painting transforms after his time in Spain, when he begins to experiment with this very, very loose brushwork. And in fact, there's an anecdote that someone came to his studio and saw his copies after Velazquez and said, "Oh, I guess you didn't have time to finish them." And he said, "No, no, this is how the master painted, and I tried to get as close as possible to that mastery," suggesting that it was something almost unachievable, right? That it was so high. Copying, in general, was a practice with a long-lasting pedigree. In fact, in many museums today, you'll see often tucked away an easel to the side, or sometimes you'll even see a copyist working on a picture. It's a tradition that goes back a very, very far way. And I love these sort of in the act paintings. This is a particularly wonderful example depicting the copying of the Murillos in the Louvre. And this is actually a painting in which we can identify each of the works. Murillo's Soult Madonna, since then, returned to the Prado Museum in 1941 from Paris. His very famous so-called beggar boy, still in the Louvre, which you'll recognize here. And the largest painting of the three, The Birth of the Virgin. So the third painting that we see on the wall. And so we see all three pictures here. And it shouldn't surprise us that a painting such as The Birth of the Virgin actually has, in museum collections, multiple 19th century copies that survive. Here's a copy that's held at, if I'm not mistaken, the National Gallery. And you can see that it's in some ways very Sargent-esque. You can see how loosely the artist has handled the paint in contrast to Murillo's very high finish. And the gallery itself says that although the painting is not attributed to any one artist, we can see the competence, the mastery with which the paint here has been handled, the sort of loose but confident quickness with which it's been applied to the canvas. So copying of paintings was a crucial activity in the period. I also want to point out this dog. It is maybe one of my favorite dogs in 17th century Spanish painting. I think, though, largely because it reminds me of my dog. He's pretty cute. And Murillo, I have to say, great dog painter. That would be a good tour to go on, right? Murillo's dogs. But I digress. He really is cute. But I digress. So we're going to see copies after masterworks happening in different ways. We're going to see these sort of almost direct one-to-one copies that we saw Sargent engaging in. Here's Delacroix looking back at Alonso Cano. I love this. I love the pairing of these two because we see how, on the one hand, how closely he's adhering to Cano's work, but on the other, we see these sort of snippets of individuality coming out, in particular in the handling of the paint, right? We're going to see artists being inspired by certain themes, by certain compositions. For instance, this wonderful painting of JacquesLouis David. The same iconography clearly looking to Ribera's 17th century etching. We see that in how he's arranged the elbow propped up on this rock in the skull. And of course, it is the same subject depicted here. We're going to, this is a wonderful quote from Manet that I'll read to you. How happy it would have, and he's writing to another painter, Fontaine-Latour, how happy it would have made you to see Velazquez, who all by himself makes the journey worthwhile. He is the painter of painters. He didn't surprise me. He enchanted me. The most extraordinary piece in this splendid oeuvre, and possibly the most extraordinary piece of painting that has ever been done, is the portrait of a famous actor. The background disappears. There's nothing but air surrounding the fellow who is in all black and appears alive. And the painting he's talking about is Velázquez's famous Pablo de Valladolid, the actor painting from the 1630s. And you can see what enthralls him here is the sort of gravitas, the presence that this painted figure has. And to me, what I love about this painting is the way in which Velázquez is able to produce so much visual interest in places that wouldn't seem to have any. So this is a painting, if you come close to it, you become enthralled precisely by the background, because you can see the attention and the thoughtfulness with which he's created these large, seemingly completely uninteresting passages of the canvas. And similarly, in how he's modulated all of these different tonalities of the black paint to create someone who's dressed only in black, and yet is wearing such a visually arresting garment. And sure enough, Manet felt the same way. He looked very closely to Velázquez's Pablo de Valladolid when, for instance, painting this work, which is now in Washington, D.C., and it's painted the very year that he returns from Madrid. So he's clearly enthralled. He's, like Sargent, taking lessons from the works that he sees from the Spanish Golden Age. And he continues in his letter saying, and then there's Goya, the most original next to the master whom he imitated too closely in the most servile sense of imitation. But still, he's tremendously spirited. But then he concludes, what I've seen by Goya so far hasn't greatly appealed to me. Now, this is what I find interesting. So he's referring to Goya imitating Velázquez. And he says, Goya imitates Velázquez, but it's just servile. It's just imitation. He's not doing anything with it. And indeed, we see that Goya does, like these later artists, look so closely to Velázquez, comparing, for instance, Menippus from the Prado and Goya's version from Zaragoza, or of Aesop. So he painted these large-scale copies of Velázquez's work in the same way that Sargent and Manet did their own, or Delacroix. He also, of course, created etchings after Velázquez, which we know that later on Manet would collect. So here's Goya's etching of Las Meninas. And Goya also, and here I think is where he he defeats this accusation of being servile, looks to Velázquez, but in some ways, I don't want to say exceeds him, but absolutely showcases his own mastery and creativity in perhaps one of the most spectacular paintings from his output, which is this portrait of the family of the Infante in exile. And you can see here that he's clearly referencing Velázquez's Las Meninas with this large canvas here, with his own insertion as a painter, and of course in the sort of density of arrangement of different figures who overlap one another, but a spectacular large picture. Now, what I find so interesting about Manet saying that, and this is my last example, is that he clearly, although maybe he didn't value Goya as much early on, right after he saw him in Madrid, he clearly did find some value in Goya, and he clearly reevaluated his position on Goya, because when we see how he thinks back on Goya in his famous painting of the balcony, it's so clear that he is, in fact, inspired by works such as the Majas on a Balcony, which would have been available to him in Paris just a few years prior as it formed part of the gallery of Louis Philippe. So perhaps he reevaluated his quite critical evaluation of Goya. But what we've seen is that artists looked back on the Spanish Golden Age in different ways, from direct one-to-one copies to sort of variations on the same theme, to much more loosely inspired works that in some ways try to surpass it, such as this one. So to conclude, I hope that we've seen in this work a greater complexity than perhaps initially revealed itself in it. We've seen this work as registering an interest in the past, as in some ways creating a vision of the past as unmediated, even though we know how actually mediated our vision of the past is through these 19th century interventions. And we've also, I hope you'll agree with me, that this is a very modern painting, a painting of modern Spanish individuals engaging in modern activities, in this case of sightseeing, but in sightseeing of forming an idea of themselves. Thank you very much.